Thank you, Micah. I went to a step study with Micah and Greg and a few other guys. It was a good time of growth. So, I am a grateful believer in Jesus Christ, and my name is Ron. So we can go ahead and get that slide up there. That is what I used to look like when I had a little more hair, and it wasn't quite as light as it is now. I want to start my story on March 23rd of 1999, a little over 23 years ago. I'd been married for 11 years. My wife and I had 3 kids. The youngest about to turn 2, the others ages 4 and 6. While I had worked full-time for Consumers Energy for 12 years by that time, I had also been the pastor of a small country church outside of Schoolcraft to the south, Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church. I'd been there for almost 3 years at that point. I was 35 years old and life was hitting full stride, and from the outside it looked like things were pretty good. That was my life when that picture right there was taken. No one actually knew that my life was spiraling. No one except for the woman that I'd been having an affair with for the previous year. I was out of control, yet believed that I was in complete control because both of us involved in the affair had too much to lose to tell anyone. For months, this woman and I had said that it was over, but it didn't end because it was our secret. I wish I could say that I finally put an end to it by coming clean, but I couldn't do it. But she had finally had enough, and to begin what would become her own recovery, she went to the church leadership. I was a pastor, and entered a complaint of misconduct against me. It was a Wednesday afternoon that I got a call from church leadership, the superintendent, we say, in the Methodist Church, who was in charge of the pastors of the United Methodist Church in that area. And he said he needed to talk with me in his office about a matter of some urgency. I asked if it could wait until next week, as I was very busy. And I knew that if it could wait till next week, then the news hadn't come out to him yet. But if it could not wait till next week, I knew that my time was up. And he said that it was indeed a matter of utmost concern and could not be addressed over the phone. I had to come to his office. He presented me with the written complaint and asked me to read it and respond. I handed it back to him unread, and I do remember saying quite clearly, she has no reason to lie. I'm sure it's all true. 35 years old, married for 11 years, 3 kids, and my life was about to implode. My one thought right then was, why am I living my dad's life? Indeed, I had been asking that for the last year, but never answering the question. There's another picture right here. I'm the little guy to the right of his mom. I've got my hand on her knee with my brother and sister and my dad. That picture was taken 30 years prior to the first picture. A great family picture taken in the spring of 1969. My dad was 35 years old. He'd been married for 10 years. He had 3 kids. He was preaching God's word as a missionary. And he was having an affair. Confrontation with his actions ended in divorce and marrying the other woman. I lived the aftermath of that decision. In 1999, I walked into the office that day knowing what was about to happen, that my life was hitting the fan, and it was going to hurt a lot of people. But I didn't want to take my dad's next step of divorce. How did I get here? Well, in the spring of 1969, my family came home to Grand Rapids, Michigan, from the Philippines, where my parents had been serving the church. Their divorce was final in December of that year. My dad remarried the next day. He moved across the state to find a teaching job, and we didn't see him but maybe a couple of times per month, and I just don't remember the visits. Within a few years, he and his wife and their new child moved to Hawaii to be closer to her family. And we saw him even less. It's always difficult for a single parent, and it was no different for my mom as she struggled through those first few years. But help from the church, her parents, and even my dad's parents allowed her to finish her teaching degree and buy a small house. I was about 7 years old, and I would stand on the couch and watch through the picture window when she left for school, her teaching job. And then I would hop down and get dressed myself. And my older brother, who was 9, and my older sister, who was 11, they would be doing the same thing, and we would all just get ourselves off to school. Latchkey kids. We were home before her, and sometimes she would come home from school and pick us up, and she would take us right back where she would be working on schoolwork while we played in the hall, and we often stopped at Burger King on the way, and we had that crown, right, that you got at Burger King. And I do remember that they were good times. The summer of 1970, she had been alone for over a year, and a friend of hers decided it was time for her to start dating again. And there was another family friend that was a great storyteller and entertained with tales of prehistoric Grand Rapids that could always be substantiated by going to the museum and seeing that the artifacts there played out and verified the stories that he would tell. He was good with kids, and he helped my mom by watching us so that she could go out. I don't know where my brother or my sister were. I was all alone with him and couldn't get away. Excuse me. I don't know how often the abuse happened. There's a definite void in my memory. I can see that as a 6 and 7-year-old, I was the victim. But what followed me with shame into adulthood was that the last time it happened, I do remember, and I was 12 years old. I vowed then that I would never let it happen again, and circumstances didn't allow for it to happen. But the shame that I carried because it had happened was enough to keep me silent. My mom remarried just shortly after my 8th birthday to a man who would teach me about faith, fatherhood, and love. He wasn't perfect, but what an awesome thing to take on the challenge of raising 3 kids that are not yours and had issues with you taking on the role of being dad. At the same time, he was in a custody battle for his 2 daughters, one of whom was the same age as myself. They lived on the East Coast, so visits were long but few. Often they would come for a couple of months in the summer. I was just a kid, so I certainly didn't pay any attention to custody battles. But after a number of years, the battle ended and he did not get custody. It wasn't until I was in college that I found out one of the determining factors in his not getting custody was my stepsister's testimony in court that I had tried to get them to take their clothes off and do things. My mom and stepdad were so upset by the obvious coaching of this testimony that they never said anything to me as a child, but were at a loss to fight against it in court. When I heard this, I remember just being in total shock. I didn't say a thing. It was all true. I didn't know until that moment that my actions as a child had cost him custody of his daughters. But I was so immediately ashamed of that I never said anything to him. I believe my first exposure to pornography may have been during that very time when my stepsisters were visiting. I think I was about that age, 10 or 11. I remember I was with a group of friends when we found the stash of one of my friend's older brother's magazines in his attic, classic. I was immediately drawn in. Looking at pictures was so much easier than trying to be with someone else. And as growing up, I was a compliant child. I did what I was told. I didn't upset the apple cart. I kept secrets so that others would not be hurt. I couldn't tell my mom what Uncle Jay was doing because he was her friend and it would make her mad. At 10 or 11 years old, I was trying to get my stepsisters to do things, and to their credit, they did not, but I was never directed or talked to about those actions. And even as an adult, I could not bear to hurt my parents by admitting the truth. Through my high school years and college years, I was a model of Christian youth, did well academically, achieved enough athletically to fit in. I was active in church, didn't smoke or do drugs. I went on summer mission trips, always agreeing that indeed sex should wait until marriage. I was plagued with the guilt that my virginity had to be defined in a very, very narrow sense. Through those years, pornography became my drug of choice. It would always be there when I needed it. Waiting just out of sight, it would rescue me when I was not feeling good about myself. It allowed for sexual exploit without the interference of another person. It created a false relationship where my needs and desires were always met. I could be it could be my secret and no one would ever know, because that would bring shame and humiliation to the good Christian man that I personified on the outside. Ultimately, what it did was completely divide sex away from the concept of relationship. They were separated. This was the state of my being when I set out on adulthood and marriage in my 20s. I didn't know it yet, but my life was being described in the Bible in 2 Timothy 3, 1 through 9. The print's kind of small up there, but excerpts from those verses read as follows. In the last days, people will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boastful, proud, abusive, disobedient, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness, but denying its power. They are the kind who are swayed by all kinds of evil desires, always learning, but never able to come to a knowledge of the truth. They will not get very far because their folly will be clear to everyone. So the 1980s were long before the internet. So if I wanted to find pornography, it had to be in print. I stayed away from strip clubs because of its public exposure and the money. I'm Dutch, I'm too cheap to spend money, which is also a problem for print media. I didn't want to buy it. So my use was sporadic and opportunistic. A summer job that I had in college entailed delivering newspapers to stores, mass quantities of newspapers, and then you were also responsible to pick up the unsold newspapers. And there's a couple of stores that would have those unsold newspapers next to unsold magazines. And it was not hard to slip a magazine into a newspaper that I was picking up. I developed a second sense of just driving along the road and seeing something along the road, knowing if it was pornography. It would just, I couldn't walk by a storefront. I couldn't walk down the road without knowing where it was. It would just see it. There were times throughout the 90s of being clean, but it was really only until the next opportunity would arise. Early in our marriage, my wife and I planned to be missionaries, but life just didn't seem to be working out that way, and I had a good job with Consumers Energy by that time. Wanting to be more active in the church, I took a course of study that allowed me to be a part-time pastor, which was all this small church needed or could afford. Our third child was born during the 3 years that we were there in the Schoolcraft area. But all the while, the exposure to porn deepened the separation, sex from true expression of intimacy within the relationship of marriage. The opportunity to retreat that I sought in pornography began to affect my conversations, so that the things that I said were always looking for types of responses in another person to see if that other person were also looking for opportunity. As I look back, I can see that this behavior had started even before I was married, but that I had never had the guts to carry through because of the devastation that I knew that it would cause. But now, after years of personal erosion, the truth of James 1:14 is clear. Each one is tempted when, by his own evil desires, he is dragged away and enticed. Then, after desire has conceived, it gives birth to sin. I ran into someone who, for reasons of her own, was also looking for an opportunity. I cannot begin to describe the next year as anything other than a pure spiral that it was. I cannot and will not try to explain how the pastor of a church who believes the Word of God can stand each week in the presence of the Holy Spirit before the people of God and live so completely contrary. It is a trap of complete and total constriction. It is pure shame and humiliation, and you want it to go away. And you don't want anyone to know, and yet you enjoy the secret you have and the power that you think you have, and that no one will ever know, because you are living on the thrill of doing something that is so totally wrong that you hate yourself for it all at once. In talking about people being slaves to what masters them, Jesus' disciple Peter put it this way in 2 Peter 2:21 and 22. It would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than to have known it and then turned back on the sacred command that was passed on to them. Of them the proverbs are true. A dog returns to its vomit, and a sow that is washed returns to her wallowing in the mud. I read the Bible. I was not ignorant of the fact that I was that dog. I was that sow. But I kept saying to myself, the affair will go away, it will stop, and no one will know, and everything's going to be just fine. I kept my pastoral mask on, in complete denial of the truth, living the insanity of believing everything would magically go away. I was completely powerless to take any action except to spin further out of control. My form of godliness was a mask, and while reading the Bible, I was unable to come to a knowledge of the truth. And then it was March 23, 1999. And in that office, I breathed a sigh of relief and did not even attempt to fight the charges because I knew that the charade was finally over. I would no longer have to expend all the energy that it takes to hold the mask up in front of me. But it was about to hit the fan. My wife's story is hers to tell, but as she describes it, I was about to back up and dump my dump truck on her and bury her. I told her that night when she came home from an event that she was attending, because my church leadership said, you tell her tonight or we will tell her tomorrow. In shock, she went to her parents' house. I made some phone calls so that while I didn't call her parents, someone else did to alert them that she was going to be arriving at their doorstep. And why? In the morning, she simply asked one question: do you want a divorce? I told her no, and I meant it. I did not want to follow my dad's next step, but that wasn't up to me at that point. 3 days later, I stood in the pulpit and confessed before the people in a very brief and simple terms of what I had done, that I had committed adultery. I had no idea then the depth of what I would discover about my life. But to make a long story short and focus on my story, my wife sought out counseling for us through Desert Streams Christian Counseling right down the road from here at Kalamazoo. We met with the counselor together as well as individually. He drew my story out of me, my feelings of abandonment resulting from my dad's departure, my feelings of abandonment from my mom leaving me with the caregiver that she did, my feelings of abandonment about God, my feelings of distrust in relationships and insecurities as I saw the relationships ended and friendships could never be maintained. The counselor helped me begin to peel back the layers of the onion, so to speak, and ran interference between my wife and myself, trying to explain my position without ever justifying it in any way. It was there that the concept of sexual addiction was first suggested as a description of my behaviors and framework to address what had become of my life. I remember him saying that the true definition of addiction is that even when knowing the consequences of your actions and that they are greater than anything you could ever bear, that you would lose your job, that you would lose your family, that you would lose everything, you do it anyway. That's addiction. And I didn't care what he called it. I just wanted out. So it was about that time, going into the year 2000, that there was a song getting some airplay on Christian radio that caught my attention. It was back when Way FM was playing a little more contemporary music. And the song was Crucible by Sarah Jane. And some of the lyrics read like this: swimming in my self-pity, climbing at the walls, wondering where I'm going and can I get there at all? Will I find love there for me? Will I find peace? Will I find anything my heart can keep? Is it the hurting now or knowing where I've been that makes me turn away and turn right back again, trying to find some meaning in the midst of it all? Will I ever know that I've never known at all? I'd trade all these questions for the chance to be healed, building a fire to melt this heart of stone with a love that burns the flesh but chills me to the bone, melting away at the core of all I do. Cast my soul in the crucible of you. I'd trade all these questions for the chance to be healed. That's what I wanted. I wanted to get rid of all the questions and wondering and why. I just wanted to be healed. It was also at this time that I flew out to California to visit my dad and my brother, to share with them what I was going through. And for some reason, I believed that maybe my dad would give me some wise counsel of how to avoid his further footsteps. But he just shook his head and said, "Why are you telling me about all this? You don't need to tell me your dirty laundry. Go home and work it out." Not much help there. But God did do a couple things on that trip. I went for a walk one afternoon and went into an open church. I sat in the pews, knelt at the cross, stood on the steps of the altar, and wept for hours as God broke my heart. And I finally felt the pain of what I had done, and the pain that I had sinned against Him, that I had sinned against God. I was exhausted when I left after hours. But something had changed. I began to understand that truly turning my life over to Him was going to have to be done from deep within, deeper than I had ever been. The other event occurred when I was having another non-productive conversation with my father about the importance of family and walking through our problems together. We were at McDonald's, and my voice isn't the quietest. And so we're talking, and this guy I had noticed was looking at us, and he walked over to us at one point and said, "Are you Christians?" I was truly bewildered, and I said, "Well, yes, I am." And he said, "I've been given a message to tell you." He said, "I don't know what it means, but I'm simply feeling led to tell you that it's going to be okay and that it will work out." And then he walked away. I returned home from that trip with a renewed sense of possibility and a commitment to work at my relationship with God regardless of what may happen with my marriage. The counselor at Desert Streams connected me with a men's group dealing with sexual addiction called The Gift: Grace, Intimacy, Fellowship, and Trust. It met at a church right at the corner of Lovers Lane and Cork Street. As my wife continued to see my expressions of repentance and God worked in her life, our marriage began to heal. In the following years, we spoke openly about what had happened. I read books and read the Bible and applied what I learned. I knew I needed to make changes. I made sure that hedges were in place, boundaries. When we went out with another couple, I made a distinct note of the fact that as couples we were friends, and if I were to be friends with one of them, it would be the man. I did not need to cultivate friendships with women outside of my marriage. My manner of conversation and the language I used should not be purposefully left open to interpretation. It should always be reflective of my relationship with God, even in conversations that had nothing to do with religion. I remember early on in this process, one of my wife's brothers casting a wary eye on me and saying, "Okay, yeah, he's in a tough spot. It may go okay today and tomorrow, but what I'm concerned about is 12 years from now." I shrugged it off. But where was I 12 years later? The hedges of language and relationship with women were in place and effective, but my relationships of support with other men were gone. My direct accountability was gone. Why be living a life of recovery after all when you are recovered? You're fixed. You're all healed. At some point, I had come to what Celebrate Recovery refers to as a crossroad, but I didn't know it. I had been deeply invested in my recovery, but instead of following through with what I would later learn were the last 3 steps that keep us committed to lifelong transformation, I turned down a different road. I still prayed and read my Bible, not daily. I was still active in church, but stagnant. And I actually can remember a conversation with my wife talking about feeling spiritually stagnant and that there was no growth. I don't know the day and time that relapse happened. I don't know how it happened. But there I was back into online porn. In the 80s, it was print media that you had to look for and hide. In the 90s, during my affair, there was the internet, but it was dial-up, which was a deterrent in itself. But the 21st century technology now offered everything at the speed of pressing a button and untraceable hidden browser windows. There was one thing that pulled the reins in. I did remember the pain of where I had been. But having started using again, I couldn't face the pain that I would bring to my wife if I ever told her that I recreated. And so, without telling her, I recreated the cycle of sin and shame that had been broken so many years before. I muddled around in this cycle of denial and insanity, the insanity thinking that it would just go away, for about a year before I broke out of the withdrawal into myself and began reaching out slowly to a few people. So about 9 years ago or so, in the summer of 2013, a friend connected me with Celebrate Recovery in Kalamazoo over in Comstock. And I began to understand that the focused growth of recovery that I had experienced initially back in 1999 needed to be a lifelong journey. Things still didn't click for me. I never spoke in a large group setting, and when I shared in small group, my introduction still of myself at that time included, I'm a faithful believer in Jesus Christ who still, at that time, struggled with pornography. But as I listened to the lessons, I began to understand that the process that the counselor had introduced me to back in 1999 was not one that ends. In recovery, we call it the 12 steps, but in the churches I grew up in, it was called discipleship. And it was meant to be lifelong. And just as this lifelong discipleship process must continue to build and results in something that the church calls sanctification, so the 12 steps could be used by God to chip away at my defects of character and give me peace. I've been clean from porn for over 5 years now. And I know that I need to turn my will over to Jesus Christ every day. That I need to use my daily inventory to constantly work on my defects of character and relationships. I need to daily be in prayer so that the most important relationship is the strongest. While I do not have a formal sponsor, I do have strong accountability relationships. And now, as ministry leader at the Pawpaw CR, I've taught all 25 lessons of the CR 12-step and have even completed a step study. And we completed the step study during the COVID lockdown via Zoom. God is teaching me how to use the internet a little bit more productively. And so I've learned over the last 20 years now that my dad got to where he was in 1969 is completely different from me. It was his life. And how I got to that point in 1999 is a different story, and it's mine. I arrived at that point due to the choices I had made. Yes, he may have played a role in the events early in my life and how those early events played out, but how I reacted to them in my adulthood, that's where I needed to ask for the courage to change the things that I could. I'm thankful that I serve a God who, as it says in 2 Samuel 14:14, is constantly devising ways so that a banished person does not remain banished from him. And then the last slide I've got here, this picture is now 4 years old, but I want my kids to know, maybe we lost it. It's a family picture taken in 2018 on the beach, myself, my wife, and my 3 kids, a little bit older than they were in that first picture. And as a matter of fact, in the last 4 years, they have all gotten married. And the 2 oldest each now have a child, my first 2 grandchildren. I want my kids to know as they develop the important relationships in their lives that they don't have to wear a mask, that we can talk about our lives and how my life has affected them and where we go from here. Today I can look at 2 Timothy 3 and not have the shame of being the man described there. My prayer is to keep my eyes focused on the truth, focused on Jesus Christ, and that I will not try to put on some form of godliness based on outward appearance, but simply live the life that Jesus wants me to, intentionally focused on Him one day at a time, one moment at a time. Thank you.